Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. We are 9 years out from the Great Recession, and still the consequences are impacting cities and towns across America. In spite of all the talk about manufacturing jobs coming back, the industrial heartland of America is still hollowed out. The recession may have begun the process, but the forces shaping this change are powerful, global, technological, and are now deeply ingrained in the future economy of this country. Most of these manufacturing jobs are not coming back. So what happens on the human side of this equation? What happens to the millions who are displaced in heartland America and all of those workers that have been a part of the non-manufacturing aspects of these communities? We see that one of the things that happens is susceptibility to political charlatans. But when that salve wears off, what's next? And what's happening today, almost 20 years into the 21st century, in places like Janesville, Wisconsin, as they try to come to grips with this new reality? We're going to talk about this today with my guest, Amy Goldstein. She's been a staff writer for 30 years at the Washington Post, where much of her work has focused on social policy. She shared the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting and has been a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. It is my pleasure to welcome Amy Goldstein here to talk about her book, Janesville, An American Story. Amy, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Jeff.
It's great to have you here. First of all, give us a little sense of Janesville as a place. What kind of town, what kind of city is this?
Well, Janesville is a perfectly ordinary place. It's a city of about 63,000 with farmland all around it, and it has a very proud, long industrial tradition. And when I set about trying to think of a place that I could look at to show what really happens when good jobs go away, I wanted an ordinary place, a place that had not been part of the Rust Belt before and had an economy that had been sustaining itself for just generations. And Janesville's that kind of a place.
And one of the things that sits at the heart of this story is this General Motors plant that had been one of the oldest operating assembly plants shut its doors back in 2008.
That's right. This General Motors plant had started turning out tractors in Janesville in 1919 and Chevrolets in 1923. So you can imagine how many generations of people worked at this plant, and often fathers handed jobs down to sons and daughters, and as a place where, uncles and aunts worked there. So if you were in this kind of Janesville family, this was good work. When the plant closed, as you said, in 2008, it was 2 days before Christmas of that year, General Motors was paying its United Auto Workers, assembly line workers, $28 an hour. So this was good work.
One of the things that we forget, and you point this out so powerfully in Janesville, is that when we think about these towns, it's not just the industrial jobs, the manufacturing jobs that go away, but it's the entire support system that is part of these communities.
That's right. So when the plant closed, it had about 3,000 employees who lost their jobs in two shifts. At its height in the 1970s, the plant had about 7,100 workers. So it was a big plant and fairly small community. But there were many supplier companies that existed in town or near Janesville because the plant existed. So there was a company called Lear that was making seats for the General Motors vehicles. And the day that General Motors stopped its assembly line, the Lear work went away. That was 800 more jobs that went away. And there were smaller suppliers that did all kinds of things for the assembly plant. So there was this ripple effect that happened. And then when all those jobs went away, if you think about a small city, restaurants didn't have as many customers because not as many people could afford to go out to eat. Or I know of a woman who ran a small daycare center that basically went under because the kids that she had been caring for no longer needed a place to be during the day when the parents were out of work. So there was this cascade of lost jobs.
Talk a little bit about what the initial reaction in the community was when the plant closed.
Well, this is something that I found really striking. I first arrived in Janesville the summer of 2011, so it was 2.5 years after the assembly plant had turned out its last Chevy Tahoe. And one of the things I began to hear very quickly was people saying, it's just a matter of time, this plant is going to open up. And that belief persisted for several years. And the reason is that there was just all of this denial. I should mention that this is House Speaker Paul Ryan's hometown. And he got a heads-up call the night before the public announcement that the plant was going to be closing some months later. And he just started yelling at the then chairman of General Motors, who gave him this phone call, and started thinking of other kinds of Chevy vehicles that, if SUVs that Janesville was making weren't so popular in the midst of the recession, well, give him a more popular kind of car to make. He started yelling all these different kind of car models, thinking, well, of course the plant was going to, get another vehicle and just keep going.
And of course, that didn't happen. How long did it take before the reality set in?
Well, the reality set in, I came to think, in waves. When the announcement was made that the plant was going to close, and this was in June of 2008, several months before it did close, there was very quickly a big effort by the state of Wisconsin and Janesville and the county that Janesville's in to try to persuade General Motors to make Janesville the site of a new small car model that General Motors was going to start manufacturing domestically. So the governor assigned a task force of people from Janesville. The state put in a lot of money. There was this big effort to try to get something else into the plant. And it took about a year for it to become clear that even though Wisconsin put in what was for then the absolute record amount of money as an economic incentive to induce General Motors to choose Janesville, this small car went to a plant in Michigan. So that was a second blow. But even then, this plant was in a status for years called standby. It was kind of limbo. Nothing was happening at the plant, but it wasn't technically formally closed. It was eligible to be reopened if the market demanded more cars. So, and for a while, this plant in Janesville was the only one in all of General Motors that was in this limbo status. So I think that perpetuated a lot of hope that maybe something would happen. And it was only about a year and a half ago in the most recent contract negotiations between General Motors and the United Auto Workers that the Janesville assembly plant was formally closed.
Tell us a little bit about, once the reality did begin to set in, what so many of the workers there thought they would do next. Did they think they would move? There was certainly a lot about job retraining that you talk about. Give us a little sense of where that conversation went.
Well, that question is really at the heart of the story that I tell in this book, which is really, I came to think of it as, what do people do when there are no good choices left? So, as I said, for a while, people thought they were going to get another job at the plant. There were some union benefits if you were a GM or, worked at the plant itself, as opposed to some of these other companies that supplied the plant. So it took a while for people to start to realize that they needed to make some kind of a decision. And as you just mentioned, a lot of people went back to retrain. I mean, that's what our country believes people should do when they lose a job that's not coming back, learn to do something else. So there was a small college called Black Hawk Technical College that focused on vocational training, which is exactly what these people went and did. There were about 2,000 people, mostly factory workers, who just flooded this small school for a couple of years after these jobs went away. And the school really tried hard. I mean, it was not an easy thing to train all these factory workers. I mean, if you think about it, you're out of work, you don't know how you're going to keep putting dinner on the table for your family. You may be 30, 40 years old, you haven't been in school for quite a while. You might not have really been a good student, which is why you went into factory work in the first place. And now you're supposed to be back in school and studying. I mean, that's a pretty hard thing for people to think about doing. And this college really tried. I mean, one of the things that they quickly realized, the instructors and the administrators at this college, Black Hawk Tech, was that some of these returning school factory workers didn't know how to use computers very well. And were kind of intimidated by the idea that they couldn't write their class papers longhand. They had to use computers for them. So the college started computer boot camps. The college started training programs for how to be a student. I mean, not just training for what they were going to try to do for a living, but training how to study. So the college really knocked itself out. But still, a lot of people retrained and didn't finish their retraining. And of the people who did finish their retraining, not all of them got jobs in the fields that they had hoped for.
What kind of fields did they look to retrain in?
Well, the college really did a good job of working with those businesses that were left in town to try to predict where jobs would lie a couple of years down the road after these people finished school. So, for instance, there were jobs at the utility company that were held by people who were getting close to retire. So the college thought, well, this is going to be an area where jobs are going to be opening up. So they encouraged people to go into electric power distribution. That was the program preparing people for these jobs. But it turned out that the economy still wasn't good and people's retirement savings were down and not so many people retired. So those jobs didn't open up as predicted. And that kind of thing happened across a lot of kinds of work. I mean, people went into healthcare jobs, people went into IT training for computer work. You know, some people got jobs in their field, but a lot didn't.
What about people that realized that if they were going to retrain, and even those maybe that hadn't retrained, that they had to move away, that if they were going to find jobs, they had to move somewhere else?
Well, you know, we have as a country the notion that if your community has lost jobs, you should pick up and go somewhere else. And what I learned in Janesville is that that's not an easy or popular thing to do. I mean, it's not that nobody moved, but this is a community in which people are really anchored in town. I mean, they have extended families in town that have been there for generations. And the idea of moving just was not very appealing to people. So what happened instead was that if you had worked at the General Motors plant itself, and you have pretty good seniority, which most of these people did, you had transfer rights to other GM plants way far away. The closest one was probably in Indiana, but there were jobs in Arlington, Texas, or in Kansas City. What happened was that there were people who became called GM gypsies. So their families stayed back in Janesville, but they commuted to these jobs pretty far away, which was their way of trying to stay in the middle class.
One of the things, speaking of the middle class, one of the points that you make powerfully in Janesville is that there's a real fundamental difference as we look at these communities around the country between communities that had been historically struggling or communities that had been poor and places like Janesville that had been thriving middle-class communities that suddenly became poor. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, that's something that I learned doing this work and getting to know people in Janesville. And it's that being poor is very different than having been middle class and suddenly falling out of the middle class. I mean, what I came to understand was that if you've been middle class and suddenly you don't have the income to support that life anymore, you're really embarrassed and you're really trying to hide it. I mean, one of the things that just touched me was one of the families that I focus on in this story has 3 children, 2 of whom were twin girls who were in high school when I got to know them. And they would go shopping for jeans at the Goodwill. But they would search and search until they could find designer jeans so that they looked like they were buying nice jeans or wearing nice jeans like all their other friends. And they didn't talk very much about the fact that their family was suffering. I mean, even though a lot of these kids had parents who were unemployed, it just wasn't part of the conversation in high school. It was a private thing. It was a family thing. And you tried to hide it as best you could.
How did the political fabric of the community respond to this? Local elected officials, city council, mayors, etc.
Well, Janesville is a pretty democratic place. It's the home of Paul Ryan, who obviously is a conservative Republican. But the county that he's in and Janesville itself are pretty blue places. And what happened was that the communities tried very hard to try to attract jobs. I mean, there were big economic development efforts by the city and the county and the state to try to pull some jobs into Janesville. And some came, but not jobs that paid anything like the $28 an hour that General Motors had paid. But even though there was this big pulling together around this issue of finding new jobs for the town, I think that as in a lot of this country, kind of the political culture coarsened a little bit over the years that I was looking at. Scott Walker is the governor of Wisconsin. He's a very polarizing conservative figure. And there were people who got upset with Walker. There are people who defended Walker, and this was going on all over the state. But it meant that Janesville, which had been a pretty harmonious place, I mean, not that everybody always believed the same thing, but people generally got along pretty well as communities go, became a little bit more divisive.
You mentioned the story about the jeans and the Goodwill. What was the broader impact on children in the community, and how did they react to what they clearly had to see going on, even if they didn't fully understand it?
Well, a couple of things to say about that. One of the people who I got to know, who I follow in the book, is a social worker whose job is with the school system as the liaison to homeless kids in the community. And she was noticing that there was a growing crop of homeless teenagers. These were often the children of people who had been working class, who were working not very good jobs, but couldn't get those jobs anymore because the formerly middle-class people who had good auto jobs were now scrounging for any job they could find. So there was, this kind of domino effect in which middle-class people were bumping down into working-class jobs, and working-class people were sometimes bumping out of work. So some of their kids didn't have stable places to live, so there became an effort in town to try to find some money, to raise some money in the community for homeless kids, homeless teenagers who were on their own. It's a pretty hard thing for a community that didn't think of itself as a place where there were a lot of homeless kids. I also got to know a social studies teacher at one of the high schools, and she was the one who really first sensitized me to the point that it was the children of formerly middle-class families that were really struggling. They just didn't know how to cope with it.
Was there conversation, was there a sense of the underlying shifts that were taking place in the economy, in manufacturing, in jobs in general, that this was a part of?
One of the things that I think I learned out of this work is that, of course, people in Janesville, pay attention to the news. They knew what was going on. But when you lose a job, even if thousands of people around you are losing at the same kind of job at the same time, even if you're losing a job at a time when the economy is terrible and not producing jobs, enough jobs or good enough jobs, nevertheless, losing your work is very personal. People have a sense of shame about it. People are embarrassed. People wonder what they did wrong to have lost this job and not to be able to find another one. So it's not that people aren't aware of the economic environment in which this is happening, but that environment, I don't think, cushions the difficulty of being out of work.
Talk a little bit about what Janesville looks like today, how all these years later the community has been dealing with this.
Well, this community is pretty much the antithesis of a place that when the economic hard times hit, just kind of lay down and took it. Janesville's a pretty resilient place. As I said, it's got this proud, long industrial history, and it's been determined to try to fight its way back. Now, how well it's doing now depends on how you measure it. If you look purely at unemployment figures, the unemployment is much better. At the time that these jobs went away, a couple months later, early 2009, unemployment had shot up to over 13%. It's now down to between 4 and 5%, so that's a big improvement. But if you look at the kind of jobs that people are working for the most part, they're not paying as well. And as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, manufacturing jobs really haven't come back to this area.
You mentioned Paul Ryan before. Not only is Janesville in Paul Ryan's district, Janesville is his hometown. Did that have any impact on attitudes or any aspects of this story?
Well, Paul Ryan had grown up in Janesville. I mean, his family is a big family in town. As he says, he's fifth generation Janesville. So when these jobs were going away, I mean, he understood this in a very visceral way. I mean, these were kids he'd gone to high school with who were losing their work, or their dads, or their moms, or their cousins. I mean, he comes from this community. So he really got what was happening, and during the big effort to try to bring another product into this assembly plant, he was very much part of that effort. At the same time, he's got his own set of political beliefs, and one of them is that Congress shouldn't provide what's called earmarks for communities. So there were some people who wished that he had been trying to draw money back home when the town was really hurting, but that's not what he thought he should be doing. He thought that he should be working on a set of fiscal policies to try to improve the kind of broad economics of this country. And people can debate whether Paul Ryan's policies are the right ones or the wrong ones, but that's what he was focused on.
What is the attitude towards General Motors today?
It's interesting because, it's not that nobody was angry when these jobs went away. People were shocked, people were hurt. There was a sense that the Janesville Assembly Plant had been turning out very high-quality vehicles, so how could the company pick this good plant to shut down? But there's not as much anger in town as I might have expected. General Motors was a huge part of this community for generations, and there's an empty plant sitting there now. But there's not. It's not a very bitter place on balance. It's not that nobody is angry, but there's not the kind of animosity towards this longtime employer that you might have expected.
Is there any expectation that Washington should help in some way?
Well, one of the things that I did as part of this work, in addition to talking to a lot of people in town and getting to know some people very well who are the backbone of this story, I also did, with help from a couple of social scientists at the University of Wisconsin, a survey of the county that Janesville's in, just to get a sense of what people's economic experiences and attitudes are. We did this survey in 2013, so it was 5 years after the closing of this plant. And what the survey showed was that people in this county, like in a lot of the country, were really ambivalent about whether the government should be helping more than it was. One thing that was striking to me is that of people who had lost their jobs, not a hugely high percentage of them were relying on the government for assistance. And I think that's part of the point we were talking about a moment ago about what happens when middle-class people lose jobs. Well, they try to kind of tough it out on their own. The idea of signing up for food stamps or signing up for welfare benefits, not that nobody did it, but it's a very difficult thing to get your head around as you're a person who would get this kind of help. It's not your identity.
Talk a little bit about what we can learn from what you saw in Janesville and the extent beyond that to which you think Janesville has been more resilient and different in some ways than other towns and cities that have suffered similar situations.
Well, the full title of my book is Janesville, An American Story, and that subtitle is intentional because I really wanted this story to serve as a microcosm or a metaphor for what's been happening in a lot of communities in the last several years of lost work of various kinds. And, I think that big picture, what I learned in this small city, is that fighting your way back is a really hard thing to do, even when you're doing everything right. This community put together, as I said, not only task force to try to rescue the plant, but they put together community coalitions to try to help people who had lost jobs. There were individual efforts like this, little coalition that was trying to raise money for housing for homeless teens. I mean, it's a very resourceful community. There's a job center in town, which is the kind of job center that exists in communities all around the country with federal money to help people look for jobs and train for new jobs. And this job center did everything that a place could do anywhere in the country to try to bring in federal money and be resourceful about helping people think through their futures. So it was doing a lot that was right, but that doesn't mean that it's easy.
Have young people moved away in large numbers?
Not in large numbers. I mean, I talked a moment ago about how anchored, how rooted people are in Janesville. And, you might think that the place is just hollowed out in terms of its population, but it hasn't. The population today is just about what it was when the assembly plant closed in 2008.
And how did Janesville respond to the issues and the rhetoric and the noise of the 2016 election?
Well, you can imagine that the morning after the election, I immediately raced to my computer to look up what the voting was in Rock County, which is Janesville's county. Because Wisconsin obviously had, for the first time in years, voted Republican. But it turns out that Janesville didn't, and its county didn't. In 2012, it had voted by 62% margin. 62% of the county vote was for the re-election of Barack Obama. In 2016, it voted for Hillary Clinton by 52%, so it was a big drop in the margin. But that said, if you look at the actual numbers, it's not that there were more Republican votes, it's that the Democratic turnout was down. So even with the union jobs gone away, the kind of union identity that has made this a Democratic-leaning place for a long time is still holding.
And finally, Amy, if you imagine or try and imagine Janesville 5 years from now, 10 years from now, do you see it different?
Well, that is the question, isn't it? What happens over time? And I came to believe that no matter how hard I tried to look at this community and understand it and look at the efforts that it was making to try to bring its economy back, these are changes that don't happen quickly. So I think it's going to take years longer to really understand whether Janesville becomes a place with good jobs again. I mean, it's a place that has jobs again, but they're not necessarily good jobs. So, how long will it take before we know whether the economy really is back or whether Janesville becomes a place that just withers a little bit at a time, no matter how hard it's trying? I don't think those things become clear very quickly.
Amy Goldstein, her book is Janesville, An American Story. Amy is going to be here in the Bay Area in San Francisco next Tuesday night, the 30th of May at 7 p.m. at Green Apple Books on Clement Street. Amy, I thank you so much for spending time with us today.
It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you.